Welcome back. You know, just a couple of days after I did a recent video with my 257 Roberts, my Model 70 Winchester, I was asked by one of my subscribers if I would do a video that described the difference between a push feed bolt and a controlled feed bolt. In the course of that video, which was describing a newer model Winchester, it's a Winchester label that's produced by Fabrique Nationale, the same company who makes Browning and other fine firearms in the world. I described how it had a control feed bolt. Now, in the manner that I said it, I suppose it would be easily perceived that I prefer a control feed bolt over a push feed bolt. Well, I spoke about it as if it was an asset, certainly, but more than anything else, you have to understand that virtually all the guns I have, except for that one, are push feed bolts. So it'd be a little bit ludicrous for me to stand here and say that I prefer a control feed bolt over a push feed bolt, when in fact I own most of my rifles in the form of a push feed bolt. But I can at least describe what the differences are, how they came to be, and what the claims made for and against either type. So let's step over the bench here and I'll describe them in detail. Now, this is a Japanese Arisaka bolt, and it follows along the same engineering style as the controlled feed action on a Mauser 98 bolt action rifle, which was designed by Paul Mauser, a German rifle designer. Now, control feed, what it essentially means is that the brass case is, whether it's before it's fired or after it's fired, is directly controlled by the bolt face. When the cartridge is resting in the magazine, the bolt comes forward and engages the edge of the cartridge case very much. Quite a chunk of that brass case is engaged, and as it's pushed forward, the only place that cartridge can go is straight up, and it therefore becomes one-in-one with the bolt itself. So they become virtually the same. That means that whether the case is being pushed forward or pulled to the rear, it's doing so trapped by that bolt. So that means it's controlled. Now, that same design was carried forward with the pre-64 Winchester Model 70 and many other bolt action rifles through the years, through the 20th century, and it does exactly the same thing with somewhat different styling because of the positioning of the bolt handle, this being a bolt handle which is off to the side rather than protruding up. So certain design modifications were made so that cuts are made at different positions on the bolt face, but it works exactly the same. The bolt face, the lower part of the bolt face engages the rear of the case, and as it's fed forward, it slides up onto the bolt face and becomes again one with the entire action, with the bolt itself. So it doesn't have any place to go, and that's a very simple process. You say, well, how does that work when you want to eject a case? Well, actually, there's a very simple blade that's mounted in the receiver that slides through this slot right here on the way back. As you're pulling the bolt rearward, it engages that and it tilts the case out and throws it out to the side. Now, that's also a benefit for those of you who prefer to control how quickly brass is ejected from the side of the gun, if at all, because you can literally pull the bolt back slowly and feed the case into your hand as it's pushed off at an angle. Or if you're in a hunting situation, you can just flick it straight back, and that case will fly out of the rifle under vigorous force. So it has that dual advantage of being completely controlled at all times, and not only forward and aft, but it's also controlled in the way that the case is pushed out of the side of the receiver. Now, one of the direct benefits to your brass if you're a reloader, and we'll talk about reloading for the moment. One of the direct benefits if you're a reloader is that the case itself does not rely on being forced against the side of the front of the receiver during the extraction process, because the extraction is straight rearward, and only after it's cleared the receiver is it pushed by the blade and forced out. So it's a very gentle type of action on a brass case. For reloaders, there's certain tangible benefits to that. It prevents denting of the brass up front, crimping of the case mouth, and things like that can occur. Not necessarily is it a problem, but it's one of those things that some people prefer. What is a push feed? Well, push feed was something that is actually quite simple. Inside this is a Remington 700 bolt. As you can see, there are no complex cuts, and we'll go over that in a minute. But inside there's a spring ring. There's a spring-loaded ring that is mounted underneath that rim of the bolt face, and that captures the cartridge head as the bolt is pushed forward. It's literally pushed. It's forced into the bolt as the bolt is closed in the chamber. Now, it requires, however, that the bolt literally be closed upon the case, because there's no force. Until that case is driven all the way forward and it's in the chamber completely, only then is there sufficient resistance to push that case and snap it into the bolt face. Now, there have been countless claims made through the years that makes it unreliable. Well, it's in theory, I suppose those theories have been developed through the years and spouted, but here's a very common version of a push feed bolt, and this happens to be in a bolt which has probably cycled literally billions of rounds, many of them under combat conditions and training conditions, and this is an AR-15 M16 style bolt face, and it has a somewhat more sophisticated extractor, but it works on exactly the same principle. It has an integral ejector, which is a spring-loaded plunger which pushes constantly on the opposing side of the case while it's being retained by the extractor portion of the bolt face. So it's very difficult to argue that a push feed bolt is inherently unreliable on the basis of the fact that the militaries around the world have relied on this type of bolt face for many, many years. So there are theoretical hazards involved with this type of bolt in a dangerous game situation. As you can see, there is in the case of this style bolt, that's not a very large engagement surface. It's rather small, and there are professional hunters in Africa who would literally refuse to go out afield with a client who had this type of bolt, because they perceived that there may not be some reliability factor there when dealing with dangerous game, that it could fail. Now, that is actually true, but it's not on the part of it's generally speaking not a part of the gun's fault. It's not the design fault. It's more the operational fault on the part of the shooter. Somebody who hastily chambers around can double feed more easily with this type of bolt face than they can with a controlled feed, where one cartridge has to literally leave the bolt before another one can be picked up. So there are certain situations where a double feeding can occur. In sandy environments, it's possible for sand or dust to get underneath that clip and to prevent it from properly, engaging around the bolt face. But again, these are theoretical more than they are real, because countless hunters have gone afield with this type of bolt face and have never suffered any problems. I will go back to this particular bolt right here. Take a look at it. You can see there's a marked difference in not only the style, but in the work required to manufacture one over the other. And for a machinist, this particular style bolt and the way the ejector and extractor mechanism works is relatively simple. There's simple holes bored where a spring is inserted behind that plunger and a pin is driven in to retain that plunger. Things are pretty simple and straightforward. To manufacture that doesn't cost nearly as much as to manufacture this, which has countless cuts. It has many different machining operations, very technical machining operations that require many different setups. And there are a lot of parts here. There's a lot of moving parts. Its simplicity relies on complexity of manufacture. So during 1964, Winchester, the original Winchester company, decided to abandon the controlled feed because of that machining effort, and its cost was basically they were not able to compete well in the market where Remington was featuring a simpler bolt. And also too, Remington was at the time for many years spoke about 3 rings of steel. This being one ring here, and then the ring of the receiver, and then the ring of the barrel itself. There were 3 rings of steel, which they used as an advertising slogan for many years to tout its advantage and strength over the controlled feed bolt. And that was probably nothing but a bunch of advertising hype, because there's really no issue with regard to bolts, the strength of a cartridge case in that region when you have normal pressures. Normal operating pressures, you'll never have any issues. There's no history of case failure back here in that region. The part of the case which is most prone to failure is this area right here, which is deeply set into the barrel, where anything upon that bolt face has no relationship whatsoever. It's a very minor point, and it was used for many years as a matter of advertising slogan, but it had no real benefit. The thing I think I like as much as anything about the controlled feed bolt is probably purely aesthetic. It's the machining of it, the design of it is spectacular. They just work wonderfully. To clean them is a matter of just turning this to the where the groove disappears. You can see there's a flat surface there. You turn this to where the groove disappears, and then just simply push it forward, and this ring right here has a couple of legs on it which retains the extractor. Now I just dropped a piece of this is the part I dropped. This is a little added piece which Paul Mauser didn't have in his. It's just a guide that Fabrique Nationale has added to their rifles to improve cycling and performance. So, but this little piece right here, which I've got positioned underneath that ring, that helps guide the bolt forward. That's all it is. So, but as you can see, there's a lot of cuts here. There's a lot of machine operations required to make that relatively simple process of extracting and feeding a cartridge. The push feed mechanism, or the basics of push feed, have been used by many different manufacturers through the years, using again the basically it's a spring-loaded plunger. This is a Ruger American bolt, and you can see it uses a slightly different concept of a extractor, which is somewhat based on the Seiko design, which had a similar type of extractor. And you know, that's not far different than what you can see here with the AR-15 bolt face. It's very, very similar. The way the extractor works is a little bit more positive, perhaps, because it doesn't rely on being in a raceway that's slotted. This one here is literally pushed upon by a spring located on the back, and it's pivoted. So it's a different form of the same thing. This right here is a tikka made by Riamaki, and it's a Seiko bolt made by the Seiko company in Finland. Now that particular function, again, very, very similar, uses the plunger ejector surrounded by steel, and then you have this spring-loaded, very, very similar type of mechanism to the AR-15 style extractor. So it goes on and on. Now I'm going to enter into the discussion something that I have rarely, if ever, seen mentioned before, and that has to do with concentricity of the cartridge within the chamber and the concentricity of the axis of the bullet down the bore. Very simply, the controlled feed bolt has got no spring pressure exerted against, there's no plunger being pressed against the rear of the cartridge case, and therefore the cartridge case, the entire cartridge, can be fed directly into the chamber in a very relaxed manner, and it can sit and position itself with the conical face. The conical face of this shoulder can basically rest itself against the conical surface of the chamber and position itself with a good degree of actual accuracy. In other words, the bullet itself is looking down, should be looking down the middle of the bore, very close to it. In this situation, where you have a plunger physically pushing against the rear of the cartridge case, that is always as long as that bolt is locked forward, that case is being exerted sideways, and it's forcing a relationship which is inconsistent with cartridge case concentricity within the chamber. Well, there are certain practical things that you have to look at. If you're a bench press shooter, and most bench press shooters actually use this style bolt, and they use it with great effectiveness. However, a lot of them, most bench press shooters elect to remove the plunger. By removing the plunger, obviously, it takes away that forceful activity of positioning the case askew in the chamber. And that's a good thing for those people who can do that. However, for the person who's going afield with a rifle, who is using especially factory loaded ammunition, or ammunition which has been reloaded with a full-length sizing die, he's working with a case which has some slop in the chamber to begin with, and now is being always acted upon and causing that cartridge case to be skewed. This is one of the, by the way, one of the things that I think is a little bit laughable about resurfacing and so-called blueprinting a bolt, because no matter what you do with blueprinting a bolt, when you have a plunger which is pushing on the side of the case, you are not by any means encouraging straight line activity on that cartridge case. So I think it's a contradictory process. So my own personal observation has been through the years that if you have factory loaded ammunition or ammunition that's never been fired before, or fully sized brass, this particular style bolt I have personally found that this particular style bolt will give me a great degree of consistency that I don't necessarily find with this style bolt. Now, it's not a scientific observation, because I can't take the same rifle and try one bolt style against the other in the same rifle. If I were to be able to do that, I suppose, and that's a scientific thing that you could actually do by simply trying it with or without the plunger. But I haven't done that, so I can't make any scientific declarations. But it has been my personal observation through the years that it's easier for me to get a push feed, I should say a control feed bolt to work more accurately, a little easier than it is for me to get a push feed bolt, which I believe this is an issue that can contribute towards accuracy issues. So if you're a varmint shooter who doesn't need to fully size your cases, or if you're a bench rest shooter, by all means you want to be sure that you, if you're using a push feed bolt, that you minimally size your case and have everything concentric. With this particular style, it's not as important, because the concentricity rests more on the consistency of the concentricity also is more favorable to this style bolt that doesn't have any sideways pressure. So that's just a small observation. I don't think it's a big deal for the hunting rifle, that's the field hunting rifle that's going out for deer, muleys, pronghorn, caribou, moose, whatever you're going after. There's absolutely no consideration whatsoever between the two, because we're talking in terms of finite accuracy issues. We're talking in terms of whether the gun is a sub MOA or MOA, that sort of thing, and that's not a matter of consideration afield in practical hunting circumstances. But I think it's certainly a matter that it should be disclosed, and it can easily affect the way ammunition is kept concentric down the center of the bore. So make your own determinations on that when you're selecting a rifle. So that's just a brief description of how the two different basic systems work. Push feed basically relying on an integral plunger ejector, and the controlled feed relies on a separate blade ejector. There are certain tangible benefits to the one that ejects forcefully, because it's positive. It's always going to eject with the same force, regardless of the speed of the bolt coming to the rear. As soon as that cartridge is free to go, it's going to go with the same force. So there's a benefit in that regard for the person who likes to be able to capture his rounds as they come out. Maybe he's shooting at a bench or something like that, or maybe he's a hand loader or field. When he brings that bolt back, he can just simply manipulate that cartridge case in his fingers and withdraw it. There's, the arguments can go on and on with in that regard. The fans of the controlled feed will say that, in a case of dangerous game, or that one time opportunity where you have to get the shots off. Remember, we're talking really about the second shot anyway, but or consecutive shots. But that person will say that, well, he has the absolutely positive knowledge that that case is going to feed into the chamber correctly, and that ejector, that extractor, is not going to fail to grasp the case rim. In practice, I don't think I've ever known of anybody who, in fact, ever had a failure of that sort. It's conceivable, it's possible that the push feed style can ice up a little bit more, precariously, because of the small springs, small plungers, and things like that. But remember, the springs and plungers that are under pretty terrific pressure. You can't push that plunger back except by some significant force. But water getting behind that and forming an ice cube could certainly inhibit the action. there are all these theories that have been promoted through the years, and it functionally works down to being a matter of cost effectiveness. Through the years, manufacturers found out very simply that it costs an awful lot less to build a push-feed rifle. The machining operations are very, very few compared to the controlled feed rifle bolt. So it's largely the existence of the push-feed bolt, regardless of what everybody has claimed through the years. The mere existence of it was largely an economic issue that was spurned by economies in the 50s, where labor rates were starting to cause a serious issue with regard to firearm costs and things like that. So you can argue it all day long. What I showed you here was the functional difference between the two, how they interact. You can make your own mind up. I personally love the Winchester Model 70, the Paul Mauser design, the control feed bolt. I just think it's elegant. It's just one of those. It's just one of those engineering marvels that it's just a part of gun heritage, which I just love. The push feed is functional. It's there. It works. It's like a gas pedal. It always goes up and down. And I don't see any reason not to own one, and I wouldn't ever advise against anybody purchasing one for some perceived safety reason, because obviously the AR-15 bolt is a push feed bolt and it works fundamentally perfect. So that is all I have to say about the push feed and controlled feed bolt. And just to let you know, Benny's still doing quite well. He actually rallied the night that I did the video. At midnight I took him out, and he seemed to all of a sudden just his tail popped up and started wagging, and his ears went up, and bright-eyed, and he's had a couple of very, very good days. We don't know what this portends. We still take a guarded approach to this whole matter, and we know that he possibly is still got some serious issues ahead, and we'll keep you posted on that. And thank you so much for all your prayers. It's helped my wife and I. I can't begin to tell you how much it's helped my wife and me, and I hope the prayers will also bring Benny maybe a miracle. Thanks be to God. And thank you for watching, and God bless.